In occupied Nazi-occupied Warsaw, paperwork could kill you. A stamp, a pass, a list of names, a line on a form. Anything written down could become a map for the Gestapo. In that dark machinery of occupation, ink itself could turn informer. Yet one Polish social worker kept writing names anyway, because the alternative was worse. Far worse. Children could vanish into the machinery of the Holocaust without even the dignity of being remembered. Welcome to Insights into History, Season 2, Episode 7, What's in a Name? Her name was Irina Sendler, sometimes rendered in Polish-style form as Irina Sendler, and in the underground, she used the alias Jolanta. That much is firmly established across major Holocaust history sources. Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust Memorial and Research Center, identifies Jolanta as her underground name and places her in the children's section of Zgoda, the Polish Council to Aid Jews. In the fall of 1943, the Germans arrested her. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum states that the Gestapo brutally beat and tortured her, trying to force from her the names of children and co-workers. She refused. Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum both say she was sentenced to death, and that fellow members of Zgoda bribed German officials to secure her release before that sentence was carried out. Afterward, she continued underground work under a new identity and had to go into hiding. That alone would be enough to make the story extraordinary. But what gives it its truest shape isn't only the arrest, or the torture, or even the death sentence. It's the logistical problem beneath the legend. This story is often told as though it were built around a single number, 2,500 children. That figure is certainly widespread. Yad Vashem, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and many public commemorations repeat it, or use about 2,500 as shorthand for the scale of Sendler's rescue work. Careful historians have added a word of caution. The Polin Museum's Righteous Project noted in 2025 that the exact number and identities of all the children are difficult to verify fully, and that the famous 2,500 figure ultimately stems from Sendler's own public statements and later repetition. That doesn't diminish the significance of what she did. It simply reminds us that even the most luminous histories must still distinguish between symbolic numbers and fully documented ledgers. Once one moves past the headline number, the real drama sharpens. How do you remove a child from a sealed, terrorized world like the Warsaw Ghetto? How do you place that child with strangers, consisting of families, convents, orphanages, institutions, who must now sustain a false identity under occupation, while at the same time assuming the risk of doing so from the oppressive authorities? How do you create a new name, new papers, a new life convincing enough to survive inspection? Finally, how do you preserve some thread back to the child's real family, in the hope that one day reunification might still be possible, when discovery at any step could mean death for the child, the rescuer, and the people hiding them? That's why rescue can sound almost too soft a word. This was logistics under terror. Yad Vashem describes Sendler capitalizing on her contacts with orphanages and religious institutions to move Jewish children outside the ghetto. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and related Holocaust history resources frame her work not as a fairy tale extraction, but as part of a clandestine rescue system involving routes, cover stories, placements, and sustained underground coordination. That's also why the arrest mattered so much. If the Gestapo had broken her, they would not only have learned names. They could have unraveled routes, placements, intermediaries, and false identities. In a rescue network like this, information isn't abstract, it's survival. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum explicitly notes that even under torture, she never revealed the names of the children or her colleagues. The legend is real, but the most important part isn't its glow. It is its precision. A woman working inside the Polish underground, in a city under occupation, trying to move children out of a sealed killing system while preserving enough of their identities that they might someday find their way back to their own names. That's not a fairy tale. It's administration, secrecy, paperwork, placement, trust, and nerve, all carried out under conditions where every mistake could be fatal. Sendler's pre-war story matters precisely because it isn't a spy thriller. It's the quieter formation of a social worker in interwar Poland, a society where poverty, nationalism, civic aid, and anti-Semitism all existed at once, as such things so often do, elbowing one another in the same crowded room. Before the war, she studied at the University of Warsaw, then worked in social welfare, before moved through the ordinary, unglamorous world of helping the poor, the unemployed, women, and children. Serious biographical summaries place her there, not in a world of cloak-and-dagger adventure. Later rescue work was not built out of adrenaline. It was built out of habits, noticing need, navigating institutions, improvising aid, and treating bureaucracy as something that could, with enough nerve and patience, be bent towards survival. Heroism, in this case, didn't arrive on horseback. It arrived with forms, files, and the stubborn refusal to let paperwork belong only to the oppressor. One of the most repeated early threads in serious accounts is her father, Stanislaw Krzyzanowski. Across institutions, the emphasis varies slightly, but the core story remains steady. He was a physician who treated poor patients, including many Jews, often when other doctors avoided them, and he died in 1917 after contracting typhus from those patients. Yad Vashem-linked materials, the Jewish Historical Institute, and other Holocaust education sources preserve that broad outline. There's a reason that story has endured. Even if some of the wording comes through family memory and later retelling, the moral pattern is well established. In some accounts, he's remembered for telling young Irina that when someone is drowning, you must help. Whether one takes that as a literal sentence or as a family ethic compressed into one unforgettable line, the lesson is the same. In her home, ethics were not abstract. They were practical. That's what makes the pre-war chapter so important. It doesn't offer the cinematic version of Irina Sendler. It offers something more useful, the making of a person for whom help was not an idea, but a reflex. When someone is sick, you help. When someone is in danger, you act. When the world later collapses into occupation, ghettoization, and terror, that reflex doesn't suddenly appear from nowhere. It's already been trained into the grain of a life. Then came the interwar period, Poland between World War I and World War II, a country rebuilding itself under strain, and a Warsaw where need wasn't abstract. It was immediate, visible, and local. Between illness, hunger, overcrowding, poverty, and unemployment as household realities, these couldn't be treated as grand theories. Serious accounts of Irina Sendler's pre-war and early wartime life consistently place her inside social welfare work in Warsaw, not on the fringes of it. Yad Vashem describes her as a social worker employed by the welfare department of the Warsaw municipality when the war began. And the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum likewise identifies her as a Warsaw social worker whose pre-war networks later became crucial to rescue work. That matters because rescue later isn't built only out of courage. It's built out of competence, a very specific kind of competence. It's knowing how institutions actually function when they are under pressure and knowing which office can be persuaded, which clerk can be trusted, which document matters, which signature opens a door, and which door is a trap. It's knowing how to place a child somewhere that will not get that child killed and knowing who is vulnerable, who is connected, who is desperate, and what levers still exist when the world is closing down. The Jewish Historical Institute's summary of Sendler's formation makes that even clearer than legend does. Before becoming the widely remembered rescuer, she had already worked in social care, in the Mother and Child Aid section at the Citizens Social Aid Committee, and had practical training linked to orphanage and welfare work. It wasn't glamorous preparation. But then, the work that saves lives rarely dresses for the camera. It was exactly the kind of background that teaches a person how need moves through a city and how fragile people survive, or fail to survive inside institutions. Once the war begins, those habits become infrastructure for rescue. Before the later story arrives in full, it's worth pausing over the world that made it necessary. German occupation turned Poland into a landscape of controlled scarcity and manufactured fear. This wasn't ordinary wartime hardship. It was policy. The occupation regime imposed rationing, curfews, forced labor, surveillance, and terror in ways designed not only to seize resources, but to make ordinary life itself feel conditional and precarious. The Warsaw Ghetto Museum and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum both describe German occupation policy in Warsaw as a system of confinement, deprivation, and coercion. In that environment, survival itself began to depend on paperwork such as identity papers, work permits, passes, and ration cards. There were residence rules that dictated who had permissions to move or permissions to simply exist. Warsaw became a city of walls, papers, and controlled access. This was the world Sendler was navigating, not a dramatic moral landscape in the abstract, but an administratively weaponized one. Then the Warsaw Ghetto was sealed. The ghetto wasn't just a segregated urban space. It was a stage in a larger program of persecution, dispossession, and eventual mass murder. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum states that the Warsaw Ghetto was sealed in mid-November 1940 and describes the resulting conditions as catastrophic, marked by overcrowding, starvation, disease, and mass death. Those conditions weren't accidental side effects. They were deliberately produced by German policy. Once the ghetto exists, helping stops being a moral gesture and becomes a crime, not a symbolic one. In German-occupied Poland, helping Jews could be punished by death. Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum both note that the Germans imposed death penalties for aiding Jews in occupied Poland, and public notices explicitly threatened death for Jews outside the ghetto and for those who sheltered or assisted them. That changes the meaning of every act. Aiding a child, moving food, carrying medicine, arranging a hiding place, preparing false papers, none of this is simply kindness in a dangerous time. It is operational risk with lethal stakes, not only for the rescuer, but often for the rescuer's family and anyone else tied to the chain. In occupied Poland, compassion itself had been criminalized, which is why rescue required much more than bravery. It required infrastructure, forged documents, and believable cover identities. Safe houses and institutions willing to cooperate. It required money, bribes, food, transit, medicine. Then on top of that, you also needed trusted couriers, quiet communication, and the ability to move through controlled space without drawing attention. The Jewish Historical Institute and Yad Vashem both describe Sendler's work in those terms: networks, placements, documents, institutions, and a covert organization, not spontaneous heroics alone. That's the true tone of the world she was working in. Not just dangerous, but administratively lethal. A system designed so that mercy triggered consequences, and every decent act had to fight its way through permits, checkpoints, terror, and the constant risk that one wrong name, one wrong paper, or one wrong glance could collapse the whole chain. This is where the practical foundations of Sendler's life became indispensable. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that after the Warsaw Ghetto was established, she used her position and her pre-war network to bring food and financial aid to Jews. That phrase, pre-war network, is significant. It tells us that what made her effective later wasn't sudden bravery falling from the sky like a theatrical spotlight. It was knowledge and relationships built before the full catastrophe. The Jewish Historical Institute describes her obtaining passes into the ghetto under the guise of sanitary or pest control work, carrying in food, medicine, and even typhus vaccine. That's not a fairy tale rescue. That's someone trained to navigate systems. Someone who understood the geography of need. Someone who knew that when politics is failing, people still need food that day, medicine that week, shelter that night, and papers before the next inspection. So, before Sendler became the rescuer, she became something less glamorous and more useful, a person who understood that in a collapsing world, the difference between compassion and survival is often organization. Then Zgoda entered the story, not as a vague resistance group, but as a purpose-built rescue structure. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum describes Zgoda, the Council for Aid to Jews, as a clandestine organization operating in German-occupied Poland from 1942 to 1945. Supported by the Polish government in exile and coordinating aid, forged documents, and rescue assistance for Jews. Yad Vashem likewise presents it as an underground council created specifically to help Jews under occupation. That changes the scale and texture of the story. Once Sendler is working through Zagota, this no longer one compassionate person improvising miracles out of thin air. Now it's a rescue effort with structure, specialization, and logistics such as money channels, document forgers, institutional contacts, placements, couriers, cover identities, and people whose job is to keep the mechanism from collapsing under scrutiny. Rescue still depended on individual nerve, certainly, but now it operated through something closer to infrastructure. Sendler's later role as head of Zagota's children's section makes that even clearer. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that she was appointed to lead the children's section in the fall of 1943 under the alias Jolanta. Yad Vashem and the museum's memorial materials use nearly the same framing, identifying her as the person in charge of the department concerned with Jewish children. That role tells us something essential. Child rescue isn't just adult escape made smaller. Adults can sometimes survive with altered papers and a believable cover story as themselves. Children often cannot. A child needs an identity that will hold under pressure, a name that fits the setting, papers that match the story, a place to live that does not trigger suspicion, and adults around them capable of keeping the fiction coherent. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that Sendler hid children in orphanages, convents, schools, hospitals, and private homes, giving each a new identity while recording their original names and placements in code so surviving relatives might find them after the war. That coded record is one of the most haunting details in the whole story. It reveals that rescue wasn't just about getting children out. It was also about trying, against the odds, to leave a thread back to who they really were. Then there was the cruelest requirement of all, separation from parents. Sometimes that separation came with explicit parental consent, parents making an impossible decision under impossible conditions. Sometimes it came in chaos, under the pressure of deportations, liquidation, disease, and terror, when there was no clean line between choice and coercion by circumstance. Either way, the human cost is built into the rescue itself. Saving a child could mean tearing that child away from the last people who knew them by their real name. That's why this story should never be told as sentimental uplift. The rescue is real. The courage is real. But so is the grief. These weren't neat acts of deliverance. They were acts of survival carried out in a world where keeping someone alive often required breaking the visible shape of their life in order to preserve the chance that any life at all would remain. To save a child, you didn't merely need a way out. You needed a life on the other side that could survive inspection, suspicion, and time. Sendler worked under the alias Jolanta, and that matters because underground work depends on layered identity, the name that lets you move, the role that lets you ask questions, the paperwork that lets you stay alive. The broad historical record supports that she had access tied to social welfare and sanitary or public health work that could be leveraged for rescue activity. The exact details of which passes she held at which moment, and how those passes were maintained, can vary across retellings. The safest way to say it is this: she had legitimate-seeming access that could be used to enter or interact with ghetto-related spaces and maintain contact networks. That access wasn't magical, and it wasn't unlimited. It was a narrow opening in a system built to close every door. Narrow openings are exactly what underground work runs on. A welfare pass. A sanitary pretext. A visit that looks routine enough not to trigger immediate alarm. A conversation that can happen because someone is expected to be there. In systems of extreme control, rescue rarely begins with grand freedom of movement. It begins with tiny permissions exploited to their limit. Yad Vashem and the Jewish Historical Institute both frame Sendler's work that way, not as unrestricted mobility, but as using welfare-related access and institutional cover to bring aid, make contact, and organize removals. That's why the life on the other side mattered so much. A child taken out of the ghetto without a viable next identity wasn't rescued. That child was simply displaced into another form of danger. The new name had to fit. The papers had to match. The placement had to make sense. The adults receiving the child had to hold the story together under questioning. The institution, whether a convent, orphanage, foster home, or private household, had to absorb that child without creating a visible break in the pattern of ordinary life. So the access Sendler had wasn't a superpower. It was something more fragile and more impressive. A small usable crack in a murderous administrative system. Fortunately, she understood what to do with it. Rescuing a child from the Warsaw Ghetto wasn't a single act. It was a chain, and chains fail when any link gives way. First came identifying a child and, when possible, securing parental consent. That alone could be unbearable. Parents inside the ghetto were being asked to choose between keeping a child near them in a system engineered for starvation and deportation, or handing that child to strangers with no certainty except that separation might improve the odds of survival. Second came moving the child out. Here the details vary, and that variation is itself important. Serious summaries don't reduce the operation to one single technique. They note that multiple methods were used depending on the child's age, the state of the city, the level of scrutiny, and the openings available at a given moment. The safest account is the most careful one. Routes and tricks varied with risk and opportunity. What remained constant was that every movement had to look ordinary enough to survive inspection. Third came creating a new identity. A child couldn't just emerge from the ghetto and remain legible as themselves. New names, forged papers, and sometimes a full replacement biography had to be built around them. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum states that Sendler provided children with new identities. The Jewish Historical Institute and related sources say the same in describing false documents and Christian cover identities. Fourth came placement. This is where rescue becomes deeply institutional. Children had to be absorbed into places that wouldn't immediately trigger suspicion. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum explicitly lists orphanages, convents, schools, hospitals, and private homes as the kinds of placements Sendler used. Fifth came record keeping. This is the most haunting part, because keeping records in an underground operation is almost the definition of dangerous. Names, locations, identity links. These are invaluable if the war ends and someone survives to look for a child. But if those same records are seized during the occupation, they become a map for arrest and murder. Yad Vashem says that when Sendler was arrested in 1943, she managed to stash away incriminating evidence, including coded addresses of children in Zagoda's care. That detail tells you how explosive the records were. Yet erasing names entirely would have been a different kind of death. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum says Sendler recorded the children's original names and placements in code so surviving relatives could find them after the war. The Jewish Women's Archive and other reputable summaries make the same point. Rescue wasn't only about hiding children. It was about preserving enough truth that they might someday be restored to their real identities if any family survived. You can hear both the logic and the grief in that decision. If we survive, we'll need to know who we are. That's what makes the record-keeping so haunting. In the middle of an underground rescue operation, where names, addresses, and placements could become death warrants if discovered, she still tried to preserve enough information that children might someday be reconnected with their real identities and surviving relatives. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum says she recorded the children's original names and their new placements in code so that families could try to find them after the war. Yad Vashem likewise notes that she kept coded lists of children in Zagoda's care. Many public history summaries say Sendler helped rescue about 2,500 children. That number is indeed widely repeated, and it's reasonable to use, with the right caution. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum uses language like more than 2,500, while Yad Vashem emphasizes that the exact number is unknown. Those aren't really contradictions. They reflect the structure of this history. A widely cited scale of rescue, alongside an honest admission that exact precision is difficult in clandestine wartime work. It helps to say plainly why precision is so hard. Clandestine rescue operations don't produce tidy ledgers. Indeed, tidy ledgers would have been dangerous. A clean, complete, easily searchable list of names, addresses, placements, and routes would have been a gift to the Gestapo. In a system where helping Jews was punishable by death in occupied Poland, information itself was explosive. So the deeper truth isn't that the number is false because it's hard to verify exactly. It's that the very conditions that made rescue necessary also made exact accounting dangerous. Names had to be hidden. Routes had to be obscured. Placements had to be compartmentalized. Records had to be coded or minimized. After the war, memory naturally distorts such complexity into a single number because numbers are portable. They fit on plaques, in textbooks, and they fit in speeches. Reality is more jagged. The scale was enormous either way, and the absence of perfect numerical certainty is not evidence of insignificance. It's evidence of the conditions under which the work had to be done. So the most responsible way to tell it is the careful way, about 2,500 children. Behind that number is the more human truth. Each child was not just a tally. Each one was a name someone tried very hard not to let history lose. In 1943, the system finally closed in. Irina Sendler was arrested by the Gestapo, brutally beaten and tortured, and did not reveal the names of the children or the underground network. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum repeats that sequence in multiple entries and oral history materials, stressing both the severity of the torture and the fact that she refused to betray the children or her colleagues. That refusal is the hinge. Rescue depends on silence under pressure, not theatrical silence, not martyrdom for its own sake, but the practical kind that keeps other people alive. If Sendler confesses or gives the Nazis any information, the chain she so carefully helped create can unravel. All of the false identities, hiding places, convents, orphanages, private homes, couriers, records, aliases, all suddenly vulnerable. In that kind of underground work, information is never just information. It's a map to human beings. That's why the story, at this point, stops being only about one woman's courage and starts being about the structure around her, including Zagota and the wider rescue network. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's summary makes that clear by describing what happens next in plain operational terms. Fellow rescuers bribed officials, got her released from Gestapo prison, and Sendler continued working with Zagota under a new alias, despite the danger. The same network she helped sustain proved strong enough to pull her back from execution. That important because it shows how underground rescue actually works. It's more than just one heroic individual standing alone against history. It's a structure of trust, money, secrecy, aliases, and quick decisions under terror. When the Germans arrested Sendler, they were trying to turn pain into intelligence. When Zagota bribed her way out, the underground answered with its own logic to preserve the person, protect the chain, keep the work alive. A rescue network is not only made of brave decisions, it's made of procedures. That's one of the most important truths in this story, because hero narratives often flatten underground work into a single face and a single moral choice. But real rescue work, especially in a police state, is built out of cover identities, contacts, money, safe houses, forged papers, fallback plans, and the disciplined assumption that sooner or later something will go wrong. That's why her survival after arrest matters so much. It wasn't just luck. It was the network doing what it had been built to do. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum states plainly that after Sendler was arrested and tortured in the fall of 1943, fellow rescuers bribed officials to secure her release, and she went on working with Zagota under a new alias. That's more than just isolated heroism. That's organizational resilience. Everything in the historical record points away from the solitary savior myth. Zagota secured hiding places, delivered money, food, false identity documents, and medical aid. Children were placed in convents, orphanages, schools, hospitals, and private homes. Records were coded. Aliases were used. Bribes were arranged. Cover identities had to hold. The whole thing worked only if a lot of people did a bunch of small dangerous things correctly and quietly. If you're moving children out of a sealed ghetto in a city designed for surveillance and control, charisma and good intentions are not enough. You need infrastructure. Forged documents that can survive inspection. Placements spread across institutions and private homes. Couriers and escorts who can move through checkpoints without attracting heat. Constant money for bribes, food, medicine, and transport. Contingency planning, because in a police state, Plana tends to have a tragically short life expectancy. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's description of Zagota explicitly highlights those operational elements such as hiding places, food, money, forged identity documents, medical assistance, networks of care. That's rescue as infrastructure. That is also why Sendler's role as head of Zagota's children's section matters so much. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum says she was appointed to that position in the fall of 1943. That's not the profile of a lone actor improvising heroics in isolation. It's the profile of someone inside a structured underground organization with roles, logistics, procedures, and a chain of trust. Sendler mattered because she could coordinate, and coordination is a rare talent in any era. In a police state, it's also a dangerous one. Hero stories like to shrink networks into one face because faces are easier to remember than systems. It's important to note that rescue work is a machine too, only pointed in the opposite direction. One machine is built to categorize, isolate, starve, and destroy. The other is built to hide, move, feed, forge, protect, and remember. The scale of logistics is comparable. The moral direction is not. There is also a crucial reputation over time fact that helps keep Irina Sendler's story honest. The hero was in the record long before she was in popular memory. The National Endowment for the Humanities puts it very clearly. In its account of the later rediscovery of Sendler, NH says that before 2000 it found essentially no public references to her outside of Yad Vashem's recognition in 1965. In other words, the archival and institutional record existed, but it had not yet become a widely known cultural memory. People often speak as if memory automatically follows merit, as though extraordinary courage naturally rises to the surface and stays there like cream in a bottle. History isn't so courteous. Sendler's case shows something more uncomfortable. Courage isn't always enough to become remembered. Sometimes what determines visibility isn't just what happened, but also whether there's a functioning story pipeline including teachers, students, journalists, translators, archivists, institutions, and audiences willing to carry the story forward. The National Endowment for the Humanities later summarized that before renewed attention around 2000, which was triggered in part by a Kansas student's project, Sendler remained largely unknown in popular memory. Multiple educational retellings say those students uncovered her story and turned it into a National History Day project that grew into life in a jar. The record can exist without becoming common knowledge. A person can be recognized by a major institution, such as Yad Vashem, who honored Sendler as righteous among the nations in 1965, and still remain largely outside mainstream popular awareness for decades. The problem wasn't that Sendler had been erased from history in the literal sense. The real problem was that the history had not yet found a broad enough audience. Yad Vashem's own materials date that recognition to October 19, 1965. That matters. Righteous among the nations is not a casual honorific. It reflects a formal recognition process grounded in evidence, such as testimony and documentation about rescue activity carried out at great personal risk. That honor should also be understood correctly. It's not a blanket certification of every later anecdote, every dramatic embellishment, or every viral summary attached to her name. What it does mean is that a credible case for rescue activity was established through Yad Vashem's recognition process, which relies on active rescue, risk to the rescuer, and evidentiary support. So Sendler did not become true because the internet found her. The underlying rescue history was already in the record. Yad Vashem had recognized it decades earlier, and Holocaust institutions such as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum also treat her activities as historically grounded. The real issue was not whether the record existed. It was whether the record had reached a broad enough public. That tells us something uncomfortable about public memory. Sometimes courage isn't enough. Sometimes you also need an audience. More bluntly, you need a story pipeline willing to amplify the record, and a public ready to hear it. That also helps explain why post-war life for rescuers in Eastern Europe was often so complicated. The danger didn't simply disappear when the German occupation ended. It changed shape. The National Endowment for the Humanities notes that after the war, Poland's communist government persecuted members of the wartime resistance, including people connected to Zagota, and that many kept silent. The war ended. The uniforms changed. Recognition remained unstable. Inside that backdrop, Sendler's life did not turn into a victory montage. It stayed grounded in work, institutions, and Warsaw itself. Multiple biographical accounts emphasize that after the war, she remained closely tied to Warsaw, continuing social welfare and public service work inside the city's post-war structures. The best-supported summary is that she quickly resumed social work after the war, helped reorganize child and welfare institutions, and continued serving in municipal and later ministry-related roles while remaining based in Warsaw. The overarching story begins with Warsaw as a city of walls, papers, and permissions, a place where survival under occupation is filtered through ghettos, passes, records, false identities, and administrative violence. After the occupation, Warsaw becomes something else, a city of ruins, reconstruction, and memory. Remaining there requires commitment and continued dedication to the place where the rescue work happened. To the long aftermath that almost never receives the wartime headlines. The post-war chapter isn't a lesser epilogue. It's the same story in a different register. The rescue years show what she did when the world was collapsing. The post-war years show what she did when the world had to be lived in afterward. As with most figures in history, Sendler's legacy didn't move in a straight line. It moved in waves, because the work she did was built for a world where survival depended on invisibility. During the occupation, the goal was not to be remembered. The goal was not to be caught. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's summary of her work makes that operational logic plain. Through the use of aliases, forged identity documents, hiding places, coded records, and a clandestine network built to move children quietly through a city under lethal surveillance, she was able to operate effectively. In a police state, rescue is almost the opposite of publicity. The smaller the footprint, the better the odds that people stay alive. That's the paradox of the first phase of her legacy. The better the work, the less visible it is. If an underground rescue operation leaves behind tidy, public, easily searchable traces, then it has probably failed at the most important part, protecting the people inside it. Even Sendler's own coded lists existed under that tension. Keep enough truth to reconnect children later, but not so much that discovery destroys them now. That helps explain a later and often overlooked fact about her reputation. The hero was in the record long before she was widely in popular memory. The National Endowment for the Humanities notes that before 2000, references to Sendler in public memory were scarce outside of Yad Vashem's 1965 recognition, and a later mention that helped launch the Kansas Students Project. The evidence existed. The broader audience didn't. Then came the second wave. Known to the institutions, not yet known to the masses. It wasn't 1965 when Sendler suddenly became famous everywhere. It was the moment when the historical record said, clearly and seriously, this happened, this mattered, and it belongs in the moral archive of the century. The wider public would take much longer to catch up. Then, around 2000, the story entered what might be called myth gravity. The National Endowment for the Humanities makes the turning point plain. For a long time, Sendler was barely present in popular memory outside institutional recognition like Yad Vashem's. Then attention surged, helped significantly by the U.S. Student History Project, widely known under the title Life in a Jar. That was significant because it showed the difference between history in the archive and history in circulation. Sendler's rescue work did not suddenly become true in 2000. What changed was the story pipeline. Once the Kansas Students Project began spreading, the story moved out of specialist and institutional memory and into classrooms, newspapers, documentaries, and international public culture. And when a story goes global, it tends to do what stories almost always do under pressure. It compresses. A complex rescue network becomes one face. A difficult historical estimate becomes one number. A morally and logistically complicated operation becomes a legend simple enough to fit a headline, a lesson plan, a plaque, or a documentary summary. That compression doesn't automatically make the story false. It makes it portable. Portability is one of the ways memory spreads. But portability comes at a cost: fewer caveats, fewer institutional details, less ambiguity, less room for the uncomfortable fact that rescue was networked, procedural, and messy. The third wave of Sendler's legacy was wider attention and simplified retellings competing with nuance. Then came a fourth wave, quieter, healthier, and anchored in place. This is different from the phase where a story spreads by headline, classroom summary, or viral shorthand. In Warsaw, Sendler's memory has increasingly been tied to physical geography such as named walkways, plaques, museum programming, and other commemorative sites that make remembrance something you can literally walk up to. Poland Museum notes that the plot around the museum is intersected by Irina Sendler walking alley, and the museum has hosted walks explicitly built around Irina Sendler's Warsaw, tying her life to specific places in the city rather than to floating, decontextualized inspiration. That matters because it changes the texture of memory. A quote on the internet can be shared, simplified, and forgotten in an afternoon. A namespace in a city does something else. It insists this happened here. Poland's own 2013 notice about the official unveiling of the street name plate honoring Sendler makes that civic function explicit. Memory moves into public space, into the urban landscape, into the habits of everyday movement. Other Warsaw-based public history projects reinforce that same pattern. The Righteous site connected to the Poland-related public history ecosystem documents commemorative plaques at specific Warsaw locations associated with Sendler, and related Warsaw remembrance projects include educational strolls and guided routes through places tied to her life and work. That isn't memory as slogan. It's memory as topography. It leaves the realm of inspiring story and becomes "this happened here." It connects biography to streets, buildings, and institutions. It resists oversimplification not because it eliminates emotion, but because place itself forces specificity. Her work was designed to leave the smallest possible footprint during the war, and it took decades for the world to find that footprint and recognize what it meant. When someone's courage is real, but the story takes decades to break through, it doesn't always mean the record was missing. Sometimes it means the public wasn't listening yet. She died on May 12, 2008, in Warsaw at the age of 98. Yad Vashem and major obituary accounts agree on the date and place of her death. That endpoint is simple enough to state cleanly, and it matters because it closes a life that stretched from imperial-era Poland through occupation and genocide into the long, unsettled aftermath of the 20th century. The meaning of that date is larger than biography. She survived the occupation. She survived the secret work. She survived arrest, torture, a death sentence, and a war designed not only to kill people, but to erase names, families, and moral reference points. Then she lived long enough to see something history often hides behind cleaner endings. Peace is messy. The war ends, but that doesn't mean the moral damage ends with it. Post-war Poland had to rebuild streets, homes, institutions, and daily life, but it also had to live with the wreckage of occupation, the destruction of Jewish communities, and the political distortions of the communist era. The National Endowment for the Humanities notes that post-war Poland brought a new reality of communist rule, surveillance, and suspicion, and that many wartime rescuers didn't step into uncomplicated public honor afterward. That's why her long life matters so much. She wasn't only a wartime figure frozen in one heroic moment. She lived into the era when memory itself became part of the struggle, when the question was no longer just who had survived, but what the country would remember, whom it would honor, and whether it could rebuild its civic life without looking away from what had happened. Irina Sendler matters because her story isn't only bravery. It's systems thinking under moral pressure. That phrase is worth lingering over because it marks the difference between a heroic snapshot and the actual mechanics of rescue. Bravery is the moment you say yes to danger. Systems thinking is what comes next, when danger stops being exceptional and becomes routine, and the only way to keep people alive is to build something that can work more than once. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's summaries of Sendler's work through Ghetto make that pattern visible. New identities, coded records, hiding places, false documents, money, medicine, networks of care. That's why it makes sense to say she helped build a rescue pipeline in a city engineered to prevent rescue. In this case, pipeline isn't really metaphorical here. It describes a set of linked steps that had to function with the discipline of a machine. There was access, finding ways into controlled spaces, or maintaining contact through legitimate-seeming welfare or public health roles without tripping alarms. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that Sendler used her position as a social worker and her pre-war network to supply aid and make contact with Jews after the Warsaw Ghetto was created. There was documentation, papers that could survive inspection, because in an occupied city identity was often whatever your documents said it was. Ghetto's broader aid system, as summarized by the museum, included false identity documents as a core part of rescue and survival. There was placement, the hardest part people often skip. Where does a child go tonight, and tomorrow, and next month? Who can absorb that child without collapsing under suspicion? The museum repeatedly notes that Sendler placed children in orphanages, convents, schools, hospitals, and private homes. There was identity, names, and cover stories a child could carry under stress. Fear makes people forget. Interrogators don't. The museum says she provided each child with a new identity. Then there was the most haunting piece, the coded record. Because the rescue was not only about getting a child out of immediate danger, it was also about keeping that child from disappearing forever into a fog of false names. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum says Sendler carefully recorded the children's original names and placements in code so that surviving relatives could try to find them after the war. It says, quietly and stubbornly, you're not just a body to be hidden. You're a person with a name. And your name deserves to survive this. Irina Sendler also matters because her life shows a truth that is easy to admire in retrospect and much harder to say plainly. In mass violence, survival often depends on ordinary skills such as paperwork, logistics, and social trust, performed under extraordinary risk. That sounds almost too modest for a Holocaust rescue story. But modest is exactly the point. We tend to imagine heroism as a dramatic burst of moral clarity. In reality, rescue in a police state often looks like administration. Documents that hold up under inspection. Identities that fit their setting. Places to sleep tonight and next week. Money for food and bribes. A network of people who don't fail one another at the worst possible moment. That's why the ordinary skills matter so much. Not because they are glamorous. Because they are what remain when everything else collapses. In that world, paperwork isn't bureaucracy. It is camouflage. If identity checks and passes determine who can move, who can stay, and who can live, then the right paper becomes a shield. The wrong paper becomes a death sentence. In that world, logistics isn't efficiency. It's oxygen. It means that a child has somewhere to go after extraction, that food and medicine keep arriving, that couriers and escorts know their routes, that a placement can hold, and that the work continues even after arrest, betrayal, or sudden danger. Social trust isn't a nice idea. It's the difference between a door opening and a door staying shut forever. A child can't be saved into abstraction. Someone has to open the convent gate, accept the risk, take the papers, hold the story together, and keep silent later. A courier has to show up. A contact has to be who they claim to be. A forged paper has to pass from one trustworthy hand to another. In a system designed to isolate and destroy, trust isn't sentiment. It's load-bearing structure. All of this happened under the bluntest possible legal reality. In occupied Poland, helping Jews could be punished by death. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum preserves German posters from Warsaw explicitly threatening the death penalty for aiding Jews who left the ghetto. And its educational materials emphasize that hiding or assisting Jews in occupied Poland carried lethal consequences. That means the tasks that look ordinary from a distance were all being performed under conditions where failure could kill not only the rescuer, but also the rescuer's family and the people they were trying to save. So no, there is no caped hero here. No miracle descending from the clouds. Just a person who kept doing the work anyway, day after day, system after system, child after child, while the city around her was built to make that work impossible. That is why her story endures. Because it shows how resistance can look like confidence, how moral clarity can look like administration, how courage can look like something almost boring until you realize the price of getting it wrong. That's a wrap on this episode of Insights into History. Next week, we'll take a look at a landmark civil rights inspiration before the civil rights movement really even started, someone often described as Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks. If you have feedback, suggestions, or stories you think deserve a deeper look, email me at comments at insightsintothings.com. Again, that's comments at insightsintothings.com. Or give us a call at 856-403-8788. That's 856-403-8788. Leave a voice message, and we may even include it in a future show if you'd like. Again, that number is 856-403-8788. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next episode.